The floor to the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, today we have once again gathered here together to register a pro forma on the unflagging attention of the Council to the Ukrainian issue. The permanent representative Melnik has surely prepared yet another proverb in the Russian language, borderline obscene. Let me give one free piece of advice. When you use Russian proverbs, learn the words from the original source. Otherwise, quotations from the Russian culture do not always come out accurately. Mr. President, we see no signals from Kiev about readiness to move substantively forward in the matter of settlement. The negotiation process is at a dead end. Zelensky should give the order to cease fire, withdraw the armed forces of Ukraine from Russian regions, including the Donbass, and to proceed to the discussion of concrete parameters of a genuinely comprehensive, just and sustainable peace. And until he realizes this, achieving the goals of the special military operation will be done by the armed forces of the Russian Federation. It is obvious that in his stubbornness of Zelensky, he's actively supported by European countries. We repeatedly stated that in London and Brussels, they only have one task: to ensure the continuation of the conflict by Ukraine, to drag it out for as long as possible, to inflict as much damage as possible on Russia. There is no plan B for the Europeans, and the talk that Kaja Kallas may become a mediator in negotiations between Russia and Ukraine can only be called a mockery. This Euro diplomat has no understanding whatsoever of what diplomacy is, and about mediators, all the more European ones, we didn't ask anyone for that. By its own fault, the United Nations is also in a completely helpless state. Having at one time taken a biased anti-Russian position, having decided to be guided by its habitual Western attitudes, the leadership of the UN closed for itself the possibilities to contribute to the settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. For example, for already 4 years, we've been asking the UN Secretary General to assist in obtaining the list of victims in the staging events in Bucha. In essence, he and his subordinates, without any investigations whatsoever, placed the entire responsibility on Russia. And it's not just simply an incident, but it's a deliberate falsification, which its masterminds used to derail the peace negotiations in 2022. On the 1st of May, a foreign minister of Russia, Lavrov, sent to the Secretary General Guterres yet another letter, which contains 12 clear questions. And we expect equally clear answers and not just brush-off replies we've repeatedly seen before. The administration of the President of the United States is trying to help. Donald Trump apparently sincerely strives to obtain a settlement, but Washington also has many other priority tasks. We are grateful for the support of the initiative of the President of Russia, Putin, to have a ceasefire on May 8th and 9th for the time of the Sacred for All Peoples of the former Soviet Union Victory Day. Many Russian citizens were able to mark this great holiday calmly. And it was pleasing also to see Ukrainians who on this day carried flowers to the monuments of liberating soldiers, and no sacrilegious clowning of Zelensky around the victory parade, glorification of Nazis and collaborators, or destruction of monuments. None of this stopped these brave people. Mr. President, the Kiev regime does not for a second stop its terrorist attacks against the civilian population, not military objects, using all available means of weaponry supplied to it by Western sponsors, who have thus become accomplices in the deaths of civilians. Thus, in April, Ukrainian fighters killed more than 100 civilians and wounded more than 667. Last week, the armed forces of Ukraine carried out a massive terrorist attack on civilian objects in the Ryazan region, and over this weekend on Moscow. From May 9th to 11th, the armed forces of Ukraine violated this ceasefire more than 30,000 times. Even during the silence regime they themselves declared on the night from May 5th to the 6th, the armed forces of Ukraine continued shelling the civilians of Russia. In the period from May 5th to 11th, 25 civilians were killed, including one child. 209 were injured, including 14 children. Majority of the members of the Security Council do not know or deliberately will not speak about these facts. but they again will play along with Kiev in placing all the blame on Russia. According to information from the Ministry of Defense of Russia, the armed forces of Russia from May 12th and 15th carried out a massive and two group strikes with high-precision long-range weapons, including hypersonic Kinzhal missiles, in response to terrorist attacks by Kiev on civilian objects on the territory of Russia, enterprises of the Ukrainian defense industrial complex, objects of fuel, energy and transport infrastructure, which were used in the interest of the armed forces of Ukraine, places of assembly and launch sites of the drones, warehouses for ammunition and fuel, points of temporary deployments of AFU and foreign mercenaries. All of these were attacked. Western handlers of Kiev are well aware that Ukrainian air defense missiles, when they miss their targets, fall on civilian objects, leading to deaths and injuries of peaceful Ukrainians. And despite this, they not only do not undertake any efforts to prevent possible tragedies, but they do everything to escalate the conflict. For example, they increase supplies of weapons, transfer production to their own territories, close their eyes to the use of the airspace of their countries for the overflight of drones. More than that, according to the information we received in Russia, Kiev has no intention of limiting themselves to the air corridors provided by the Baltic states. Drones, it's planned that they will be launched from the territory of those countries. And the agreement for that, Zelensky was convinced upon, stressing that it will be impossible to identify the exact sites from which they will be launched. Drone forces have already been sent to Latvia. They are deployed in Latvia bases and also in Latvia and Daugavpils and Kaupalpis. I would like to draw attention to all of those who are helping Kiev and tell them that contemporary intelligence means as such that we can clearly identify the launch sites for drones, and also data can be received when you study the wreckage of drones, as was the attempt when Zelensky made an attempt to attack the president's residency of the Russian president in December. And yes, prominent representative of Latvia, the foreign intelligence of Russia did say that the coordinates of decision-making centers in Latvia are well known, and membership in NATO will not protect you from retaliation, even if you are a member of NATO. I now address the reasonable members of Security Council. You must not be deceived by lamentations about the suffering of peaceful Ukrainians. In reality, the off-the-chart intensity of Russophobia in the statements of Europeans, so-called leaders, leave no doubt that they're conducting accelerated preparations for war in Russia, instilling in the people of their countries the idea that peaceful settlement in Ukraine will mean inevitable attacks by Russia on Europe. This reckless rhetoric is used in order to justify financing of the Kiev regime at the expense of the urgent needs of ordinary Europeans. Mr. President, our meeting today will not be complete if we do not highlight what is now happening within the ruling elite in Ukraine. Zelensky was elected under the slogan that he was a servant of the people. However, recently, more and more facts are coming to the surface of monstrous corruption among his closest circle, which the Western press for a long time presented as symbols of a new anti-corruption Ukraine. And these are not isolated abuses of individual officials, but a large-scale institutional model which is embedded in the mechanism of Ukrainian power and which is directly connected with the distribution of Western financial and military assistance. These funds went not to social programs and not to reconstruction of infrastructure, but to elite real estate and offshore accounts. Never will the Kiev regime will wash itself clean from the monstrous schemes revealed during the Midas operation and recorded on the so-called Mindich tapes. We do not have any doubt that the EU-approved assistance package of 90 billion euros will also be stolen. Against this background, especially monstrous looks the continued campaign of forced mobilization. Last week in Kharkov, a married couple, when they brought their daughter to school, were pushed by identified men into a minibus under indignant shouts of witnesses. After eyewitnesses started screaming, I quote, this person feels bad, the child is crying, they received pepper spray in their faces. Another case was in Dnipropetrovsk at the beginning of the month. A man fell into a coma as a result of a cranial injury, which resulted from a blow by someone from the territorial recruitment center. The official version is that the man fell himself and hit his head. In Dnipropetrovsk, another person, 43 years old, was hospitalized with severe injuries literally a few hours after mobilizing and then died. The recruitment center stated that he allegedly had an epileptic seizure, even though he never suffered from epilepsy. In Odessa, a gang operated consisting of employees of the recruitment center and police, and they were engaged in extortion and beatings of those who are liable for military service. All this shows eloquently that in Ukraine there are neither servants of the people or beacons of democracy. There's only a group of criminals bound by thirst for money and power, which turns its own people into slaves whose lives are worthless to them. The so-called collective West, which created such a regime and continue to finance it, bears full responsibility not only for the conflict it provoked, but also for the lives of all of these people.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, I thank the Presidency of China for convening this meeting and express my gratitude to the delegations of Denmark, Greece, France, Latvia and the United Kingdom for supporting Ukraine's request. I'm also thankful to the distinguished briefers, Director Goto and Director Vosornu, for your detailed presentations, confronting once again the Security Council with clear evidence of Russia's crime of aggression, systematic war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in and against Ukraine. We commend the courageous work of the United Nations institutions on the ground, which continue to address the devastating consequences of Russia's war of extinction. Mr. President, before turning to my statement, I cannot refrain from reacting to yet another display of crocodile tears by the representative of Russia, who once again seeks to squeeze sympathy and compassion out of this chamber. Stop complaining about the suffering of poor Russians. What Russia is witnessing is the boomerang of war, launched by Putin against Ukraine, and now returning with the triple force, striking with painful precision the very hand that set it in motion. Those who sow the wind will reap the whirlwind, and I cannot help addressing you again in Russia.
Enough of shedding tears and
indulging in self-pity. Unlike Russia, Ukraine's forces never target civilians. We only destroy military assets in full compliance with international humanitarian law, and we reject all the fairy tales that we just heard, also about some Ukrainian soldiers in Latvia. Just stop lying. Mr. President, the first half of May has become one of the deadliest periods for Ukrainian civilians since the beginning of the Russian Federation's full-scale military invasion, reaching a new level of barbarism. The Russian armed forces have continued to deliberately and systematically attack the civilian population in Ukraine. Between the 1st and 11th of May alone, Russia launched over 600 attack drones and 16 ballistic missiles against Ukrainian cities and communities. More than 40 civilians were killed and over 200 were injured. On the 5th of May, Russia struck multiple regions simultaneously. In Zaporizhia, Russian troops carried out a combined bomb and drone strike on a residential district, killing 12 people and injuring 46. In Kramatorsk, bombs were dropped on the city center, killing 6 civilians and injuring 13. In Dnipro, a strike on an industrial facility killed 4 people and injured 16. In the Poltava region, missiles and drone strikes on a gas extraction facility killed 5 people. including 2 rescue workers who were deliberately targeted in a second Russian strike while responding to the fire. At least 37 people were injured in the region. In Chernihiv, a drone struck the regional prosecutor's office, injuring 17 civilians. These outrageous Russian terror attacks occurred just hours after President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, announced a ceasefire to take effect during the night of 5th to 6th May and called on Putin to take genuine steps toward ending its war of aggression. Ignoring this appeal, the Russian armed forces continued their perfidious assaults against the civilian infrastructure, including a strike on a kindergarten in Sumy on the 6th of May, where 2 people were killed and 7 civilians were seriously injured. The 3-day ceasefire was ultimately agreed for the 9th and 11th of May, following a statement by the US President Donald Trump. Ukraine honored it fully and was ready for its continuation, as the continued assault of drones and strike along the front line, even this period, were registered. These 3 days were used by Moscow to accumulate more missiles and long-range attack drones, which were unleashed against Ukrainian cities just after that. The scale of Russia's terror continues to increase. Last week, Russia launched more than 3,170 attack drones, over 1,300 guided bombs and 74 missiles against Ukrainian civilians. During this week, at least 52 people were killed and 346 civilians were injured across Ukraine. The 14th of May was one of the deadliest days. Russian troops used more than 1,500 drones and 56 missiles. Strikes were recorded in most regions of Ukraine, from Zakarpattia to the Kharkiv region, including Ivano-Frankivsk, Rivne, Volyn, Odessa, Poltava and Sumy. Dozens of people were killed and wounded. Kyiv suffered the most. A 9-story residential apartment building was completely destroyed. A Russian high-precision cruise missile, the X-101, equipped with a 400-kilogram high-explosive cluster warhead, turned it into a pile of rubble, which became a collective grave. As a result of this heinous attack, 24 civilians were killed in their sleep, including 3 children. Lyubava Yakovleva, a 12-year-old girl, and her elder sister, Vera, aged 17, as well as 14-year-old Maria. They were murdered that fateful night. The sisters were buried just this morning. More than 50 people were wounded as a result of that Russian strike. Mr. President, regrettably, all these barbaric crimes committed by Russia against Ukrainian civilians every single day have still not met with an adequate response from the international community. The staggering numbers of innocent victims, the kind that should make one's hair stand on end, fail to provoke not only a commensurate action, but even a meaningful emotional reaction in this Council. And therein lies one of the most cynical aspects of Putin's strategy to desensitize this war, to reduce even the most horrific crimes against humanity to nothing more than a routine wartime statistics. Investigations have shown that this missile, which hit a building in Kyiv, was produced just a few months ago using a substantial number of foreign-made components, including parts imported by Russia from Western Europe and North America. The very fact that Putin is still able to manufacture such lethal weapons with the supply from abroad is nothing short of a scandal. We therefore call upon all UN member states to enhance sanctions regime and to prevent the delivery of components to Russia's missile program and to Russia's war machine. Distinguished members of the Council, I must also draw your attention to a deeply alarming development. The humanitarian situation and the catastrophe unfolding in the temporarily occupied areas of Kherson region, especially in cities of Oleshki, Hola Pristan, Stara, Zburivka and Novozburivka, urgently demands this Council's attention. Russian forces are deliberately blocking the departure of civilians and obstructing the supply of basic goods, food, water and medicine. Critical infrastructure has been completely destroyed there. There is no electricity and no gas supply. These communities are on the brink of collapse. Civilians attempting to purchase food or leave by private vehicle are literally hunted by Russian drone strikes. More than 6,000 people require urgent humanitarian assistance, including approximately 200 children. The majority are persons with limited mobility. We call on UN member states to force Russia to comply with international humanitarian law to allow evacuation corridors for those Ukrainians who wish to leave. Mr. President, we praise the efforts of the UN mission in Ukraine aimed at alleviating the suffering of civilians, especially along the front lines. 5 days ago, as we just heard, Russian forces struck a humanitarian convoy of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in Kherson region using 2 FPV drones. Russia deliberately tries to kill those delivering medicine, food and essential supplies to the civilian population in the Kherson Oblast. In doing so, Russia is openly spitting in the face of our UN family. These Russian war crimes against the UN cannot be tolerated. This attack was not an isolated case, as we also just heard in this Council. A week ago, Russia attacked a World Food Programme cargo shipment in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. Thus, we call on all member states, particularly the signatories of the Declaration on the Safety of Humanitarian Personnel, to condemn these perfidious Russia's attacks and intensify pressure on Moscow to stop these crimes. Mr. President, Ukraine reiterates its commitment to the restoration of the comprehensive, just and lasting peace founded on the principles of the UN Charter. This requires full accountability for all those responsible for international crimes. We therefore welcome the decision of the Council of Europe 4 days ago establishing the steering committee of the Special Tribunal for the Crimes of Aggression against Ukraine. 36 states, together with the European Union, have become parties to this agreement. Judges will be appointed, prosecutors selected, and the structures of the tribunal will be put in place in The Hague. Thus, the accountability of Russia leadership is unavoidable. It is just a matter of time. Dear colleagues, we once again call upon the member states of the Security Council to table, without further delay, a resolution on immediate and unconditional ceasefire, the exchange of prisoners of war on an all-for-all basis, as well as the return of all deported Ukrainian children and unlawfully detained Ukrainian civilians. Once again, we appeal upon all UN member states to tighten and fully enforce sanctions against the Russian Federation, especially targeting its military industry, energy, revenues, and access to critical technologies. We call again, not just on our allies, but all member states to accelerate and expand military assistance to Ukraine, enabling us to protect civilians, defend our cities, and compel Mr. Putin to stop his barbarian war of aggression. We encourage all UN member states to support accountability mechanisms, including the special tribunal that I mentioned, and ongoing investigations of Russian war crimes. Mr. President, despite Mr. Putin's boasts about alleged successes, his troops, even Russian pro-war military bloggers, are criticizing disasters on the battlefield. Many of them openly acknowledge that the current momentum favors Ukraine. Moreover, some Russian military experts warn that Mr. Putin is losing this war. With the front line stalled, an estimated almost 1.4 million Russian troops dead or wounded, and ordinary Russians under increasing economic pressure. The war that Putin believed would produce his crowning life achievement will prove to be his final downfall. For Russians, this war was not a long time, something that happened far away, but now they feel the consequences of the criminal decisions of their leaders. Ukraine's drones and missiles routinely hit legitimate military targets deep inside the aggressor's territory, often more than 1,000 kilometers from our border. In recent months, Ukraine's legitimate drone strikes have taken roughly 20% of Russia's refining capacity offline, while disrupting export and logistic flows by hundreds of thousands of barrels a day. The result is a steady loss of billions of dollars in potential monthly revenues due to critical hits of Ukrainian forces. Ukraine has been pursuing a strategic neutralization of war assets in Russia, embracing long-range asymmetric warfare to degrade Russia's crumbling economy, rupture its military manufacturing, and further deflate civilian morale. This spring, our strategy is not just bearing fruit, it is completely shifting the battlefield calculus. It is gradually becoming a game changer. We are reaching a turning point in Russia's war. As I elaborated in my previous statements before this Council, the war has severely battered Russia's economy. The army and military industry's huge appetite for manpower has created an acute labor shortage that has drastically showed and slowed economic growth, squeezed small businesses already reeling from tax increases, and raised inflation as companies compete for workers. According to official figures, 2/3 of Russian small businesses didn't turn a profit in the first quarter of this year. Economic growth fell sharply. 2026 is already off to a bad start. GDP shrank by 0.3% year-on-year during the first quarter. If things in the rear don't look good, the same goes for the front. The Russian armies and its advances this year have been minimal, in part because Ukrainian drone welfare has transformed the battlefield. For about 2 years, Russian commanders have tried to use mass-armored and mechanized units capable of punching through the 1,500-kilometer front line and seizing territory because Ukraine's drones quickly spot concentrations of men and material and precisely strike it. Russia switched to sending small groups of soldiers to infiltrate Ukrainian lines and established footholds for follow-on forces. But because drones strike infiltrating infantry so effectively, this adaptation is not producing any results. The momentum of Russian advances has slowed tremendously this year. In April, Ukraine could liberate more territories than the Russian troops were able to occupy. Few places illustrate strategic failure of Russia's war as vividly as Malotokmachka, a village in Zaporizhia region so tiny it once barely appeared on the maps, yet so resilient it has defied years of Russians' triumphant predictions. Repeatedly declared on the verge of capture by pro-Kremlin commentators for years, it still remains unconquered, exposing the gap between Russia's propaganda and reality. Malotokmachka symbolizes not merely a tactical impasse, but the broader unraveling of Russia's narrative of inevitable victory. With a touch of irony, one could know that Russia's never-ending attempts to seize Malotokmachka, now stretching beyond 1,500 days, have lasted longer than some of history's most legendary sieges, from ancient Carthage to Rome, proving that even imperial ambitions can become hopelessly stuck before a village no one had ever heard of before the war. Mr. President, just a few days ago, the world witnessed what has become a turning point in Russia's war. No, it was not a breakthrough in the battlefield. It was the painfully theatrical victory parade that was staged by Mr. Putin on the 9th of May, a Potemkin spectacle, conceived as a demonstration of imperial strength. Instead, it looked like a Russian empire rehearsing its own obituary. Ukraine's new capabilities of deep drone strikes forced Mr. Putin to pare back his military parade. He has to beg US President Donald Trump to arrange the ceasefire with Ukraine so that this pitiful parade, or better to say masquerade, could proceed. This episode was perhaps the greatest self-humiliation in modern Russia's history. Although this spectacle did take place, but stripped of grandeur and heavy with desperation, the illusion of Russia's invincibility was ultimately cracked. What was intended as a celebration of Russia's superpower marked the beginning of the end for Moscow's imperial ambitions and the imminent collapse of Putin's rule, teetering on its military, economic and moral bankruptcy. As one commentator aptly put it, the parade proved to be a requiem for Putin's military ambitions. He is really getting nervous and seeks to mask this humiliating failure with loud rhetoric and further terror against Ukraine's civilian population. Just one day after this parade, Putin once again returned to his old favorite trick, the nuclear blackmail. He announced the testing of the intercontinental Sarmat missile, capable of carrying up to 16 nuclear warheads. We all know this pattern. Whenever the Russian regime fails to achieve victories on the front line, it immediately turns to apocalyptic threats and nuclear saber rattling. Moreover, there is another matter of grave concern. Mr. Putin just initiated Russia-Belarus nuclear exercises. The deployment of Russian tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus, coupled with joint nuclear drills, represents an unprecedented challenge to the global security architecture. These actions directly violate Articles 1 and 2 of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which prohibits both their transfer and the receipt of control over weapons of mass destruction. By turning Belarus into a nuclear staging ground, Putin is legitimizing nuclear proliferation, setting an extremely dangerous precedent for authoritarian regimes worldwide and further entrenching Minsk as an accomplice in Russia's nuclear blackmail. Such a deliberate crossing of all NPT red lines cannot go unanswered. That is precisely why today we call upon all nuclear weapon states, France, the United Kingdom, the United States, and also China, not to ignore or tolerate these threats as mere rhetoric. Russia's trampling of its international obligations must not just be condemned. We need a new sanctions regime against Russia's nuclear arsenals. Mr. President, despite the fact that Russia cannot win this war, we continue to hear the same shameless demands of Mr. Putin that Ukraine must capitulate. He continues to insist on Ukraine's surrender. But our reply to Russia is very simple. Шиш вам с маслом, don't hold your breath. И прощай, немытая Россия. Страна рабов, страна господ. Farewell, unwashed Russia, the land of masters and slaves. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for the statement and
In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Kayako Goto, Director for Europe, Central Asia, and the Americas, Departments of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations. And Ms. Adam Wasornu, Director, Crisis Response Division, Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It is so decided.
The
Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Kayako Goto.
You have the floor, madam.
Mr. President, well into its 5th year, the war in Ukraine is becoming deadlier by the day. In the last week alone, we witnessed one of the largest aerial bombardments of Ukraine since the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion in February 2022. Between 13 and 14 May, the Russian Federation reportedly launched more than 1,500 drones and dozens of missiles targeting Ukrainian cities across the country. In the deadliest incident of this massive attack, on 14 May, a Russian missile reportedly flattened a 9-story apartment block in Kyiv's Davnitsky district. 24 people, including 3 girls aged 12, 15, and 17, were reportedly killed. At least 48 others, including 2 children, were reportedly injured. On 13 May, strikes on more than 20 localities across Ukraine, including in western regions, reportedly result in numerous civilian casualties. These large-scale attacks have continued daily, including in Dnipro and Odessa, resulting in further civilian casualties and damage to critical civilian infrastructure. Last month alone, at least 238 civilians were killed and 1,404 injured in Ukraine. This represents the highest monthly number of civilian casualties recorded since July 2025. It also reflects a continuing pattern of rising civilian harm. Since February 2022, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has verified that at least 15,850 civilians, including 791 children, have been killed in Ukraine. Another 44,809, including 2,752 children, have been injured. Actual figures are likely significantly higher. Mr. President, inside the Russian Federation, reported Ukrainian strikes have also led to increasing civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure, including 2 residential buildings. Just this Sunday, 17 May, 4 people have reportedly killed in large-scale Ukrainian strikes across the Russian Federation, including in Moscow. Earlier, in an attack on 15 May, 4 people, including a child, were reportedly killed in Ryazan. We strongly condemn all attacks against civilian and civilian infrastructure wherever they occur. As we have repeatedly underscored, such attacks are prohibited under international humanitarian law and must end immediately. Mr. President, last week, United Nations personnel in Ukraine were involved in 2 alarming drone-related incidents. On 14 May, a United Nations vehicle was struck twice in Kherson, where repeated drone attacks have made life extremely dangerous for civilians. The clearly marked vehicle was part of an interagency humanitarian mission led by the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. The mission had been notified to the parties well in advance. This followed an incident on 12 May when another clearly marked United Nations vehicle that was part of a World Food Programme humanitarian convoy was reportedly hit by a remote-controlled drone in Dnipropetrovsk region. International law, including international humanitarian law, must be respected at all times. Civilians, including humanitarian relief personnel, as well as civilian objects, must be protected at all times. My colleague from OCHA will address this in her statement, as the United Nations is working to establish the full facts surrounding these unacceptable incidents. Mr. President, amid rising devastation and loss of life, on 9 May, the Secretary General welcomed the announcement of a 3-day ceasefire from 9 to 11 May between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. We commend the efforts of the United States to facilitate this agreement, which allowed for a brief pause in the large-scale strikes targeting major cities. However, we regret reported violations on both sides throughout the brief truce, mainly along and near the front line. We are also deeply disturbed by the escalation of attacks by the Russian Federation almost immediately following the expiry of the ceasefire. Mr. President, on 9 May, the Secretary General also welcomed the announcement of an agreed exchange of 2,000 prisoners of war between Ukraine and the Russian Federation, mediated by the United States. As a first step, 205 prisoners from each side were returned on 15 May. We urge the sides to finalize the details and fully implement all phases of the agreed large-scale exchange for the sake of the remaining prisoners and their families. We also urge the sides to continue talks towards further exchanges. Separately, we remain concerned about the fate of deported and forcibly transferred Ukrainian children. Their prompt and safe return will require consistent engagement by both sides. Last month, the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict visited Ukraine and the Russian Federation as part of the United Nations commitment to support these efforts. I echo the Special Representative's call that our work must be guided by the lives behind the numbers. Each child's case is unique and requires an individualized, independent, and impartial assessment rooted in the best interest of the child and the preservation of family unity wherever possible. Mr. President, 1 year has passed since direct negotiations between Ukraine and the Russian Federation resumed. Although direct talks, which are currently paused, have yet to result in a breakthrough, diplomacy has made it possible for thousands of prisoners of war to return home and for remains of fallen soldiers to be laid to rest. Negotiations should resume without further delay to prevent further escalation and to make meaningful progress towards a full, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire. Dialogue grounded in genuine political will and adherence to the United Nations Charter, international law, and relevant United Nations resolutions is the only way to achieve a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace. The United Nations remains ready to support all meaningful efforts to that end. Thank you.
我感谢
I thank Ms. Gotal for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Adam Wasornu.
Mr. President, humanitarian workers in Ukraine came under repeated attack last week. As mentioned by my DPPA colleague, 2 separate convoys clearly marked as being part of the United Nations were hit while carrying life-saving assistance to civilians in need. Both missions had been notified well in advance through established channels. On May 12, WFP struck that had delivered food to frontline communities was hit by a drone in Dnipro region, injuring the driver. On May 14, a United Nations vehicle on a humanitarian mission was struck by a drone in Kherson city. My OCHA and DSS colleagues were on that convoy. 20 minutes later, the vehicle without our colleagues was struck again. These brazen incidents are not isolated. In the same week, other humanitarian missions were hit, injuring humanitarian workers and damaging humanitarian assets. On May 14, a World Central Kitchen van delivering hot meals to civilians was hit, damaging the vehicle. On May 15, a Ukrainian NGO delivering food to a collective site was hit, injuring 2 people, one of whom remains in critical condition. Between January and April of this year, 3 humanitarian workers were killed, 10 others injured. These attacks are intensifying, making the delivery of humanitarian assistance increasingly difficult, if not impossible in some areas. Humanitarian workers in Ukraine are taking immense risks to save lives. However, the weapons being deployed, cheap, deadly, are rapidly changing what it means to deliver life-saving humanitarian assistance. Humanitarian workers and assets must be respected. This entails taking active steps to spare them. Attacking them directly is strictly prohibited and can amount to war crimes. We call on all parties to urgently assess these incidents so they do not happen again. Mr. President, Excellencies, these attacks happened as violence against civilians is increasing across the country. Drones have struck public buses in Kherson, killing people on their way to work. In Poltava, first responders who came to put out a fire at a gas facility were killed alongside the workers they were trying to help. Short-range drones killed more civilians in April alone than in any other month since February 2022. On May 14, as you have just heard from DPPA, the population of Kyiv faced deadly, large-scale attacks that killed and injured scores of civilians, including children, as you've heard. We commend the work of national first responders in their efforts to continue to rescue civilians. Mr. President, the rules of war are binding to all parties to armed conflict and aim to limit human suffering and spare those who are not fighting. When clearly marked humanitarian convoys, civilians going about their daily lives, and first responders rushing to help are killed and injured again and again, this shows a pattern that defies international humanitarian law. Civilians and civilian objects must be spared, must be respected. Mr. President, despite the dangers, we continue to deliver humanitarian assistance wherever access allows. Since February 2022, the United Nations and our partners have carried out 250 humanitarian convoys to frontline communities. In April alone, the World Food Programme provided nearly 160,000 people with food across 7 frontline regions. I remain deeply concerned about the situation for civilians in and around frontline communities. Whatever side of the line they may be, every day is a matter of life and death. Over a single weekend this month, 930 civilians, including more than 180 children, were evacuated from frontline areas in Donetsk with humanitarian support. OCHA can work with the parties on arrangements to support voluntary, dignified, safe evacuations and ensure safe and regular humanitarian access to frontline communities. Mr. President, humanitarian needs continue to grow, even as diplomatic efforts continue. We are reaching only a fraction of the 10.8 million people who need humanitarian assistance. We have received some $845 million of the $2.3 billion required. $1.7 billion is still needed. Funding is not simply about keeping operations ongoing. It determines whether civilians trapped near the front line receive medical care. It determines whether families displaced by fighting can stabilize their lives. And it determines whether humanitarian organizations can remain present where the needs are greatest. Mr. President, my ask to this Council, not new. First, please use your influence to ensure that international humanitarian law is respected. Wars have rules, they are unequivocal. This means ensuring the protection of civilians, including by allowing them to voluntarily leave for safer areas. This means ensuring rapid, unimpeded humanitarian access to civilians in need wherever they are. We need the active engagement of parties to facilitate this. Without immediate action, it will become even harder to deliver aid and civilian suffering will deepen. Second, provide timely funding. Delays in funding force impossible choices about who receives assistance and who does not. Mr. President, Excellencies, civilians across Ukraine cannot wait for a political breakthrough to be protected and to have their basic needs met. Protection, humanitarian access, funding remain essential while efforts towards a just and lasting peace continue. I thank you.
I thank Ms. Wosornu for her briefing and now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank DPPA Director Goto and OCHA Director Wiserno for their briefings. Mr. President, in the lead-up to the 9th of May, Russia asked Ukraine not to attack its military parade in the Red Square. Ukraine generously agreed as a humane gesture. In response, Russia committed the largest attack yet against Ukrainian civilians and children. 1,567 long-range drones and 56 missiles launched by Russia on 13th and 14th May. Among the at least 39 people killed was 3 girls. Among the more than 175 injured were first responders, wounded in double-tap strikes. There will be justice for these crimes and all atrocities committed by Russia. Last week in Chisinau, Moldova, 36 countries approved the establishment of the Special Tribunal for the crime of aggression. Latvia urges all countries committed to safeguarding the rules-based international order to join the Special Tribunal. Mr. President, this war has 2 parties: Russia, the aggressor that wages an unprovoked war of choice, a war of aggression in violation of the UN Charter, a war against its sovereign, peaceful neighbor, and Ukraine, a sovereign state defending itself in line with Article 51 of the UN Charter. The Ukrainian people never wished for this war. They, most of all, want the war to end. Yet they are fighting for their existential survival, for Ukraine's freedom, sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. Russia, however, is not accepting the reality that it is failing its own war on all fronts: military, political, economic, and that its military is unable to match the innovative Ukrainian army. Instead, Russia continues escalating its barbaric large-scale attacks against civilians. As a result, more people were killed and injured in Ukraine in the first 4 months of 2026 than in the same period of the previous 3 years. The attack on residential neighborhood in the city of Dnipro on the night from 17th to 18th of May destroyed or damaged over 20 residential buildings, a school, and a kindergarten. Russia has established a humanitarian blockade around the occupied village of Oleshki by using drones to mine the access roads and hunting civilian cars and delivery vans. Civilians are trapped in the village with limited food supplies and no drinking water. Mr. President, Latvia condemns in the strongest terms Russia's escalatory attacks against civilians and United Nations humanitarian personnel as unforgivable violations of international law. Unimpeded humanitarian access is critical. As mentioned by the briefers, last week alone, 2 targeted attacks against clearly marked UN humanitarian convoys. These are not accidents, but a repeated and deliberate pattern carried out by Russia in a clear violation of international humanitarian law. This year alone, there have been 56 incidents, with 3 humanitarian workers killed and 10 injured. Russia also continues to verbally attack the UN system and independent monitors. Facts and evidence will not bend to the fantasies of Russian leadership. If Russia wants anyone to listen to its allegations, it must provide full and unimpeded access to independent monitors. Russia frequently uses distortion of facts to spread hostile disinformation. One such case concerns Russia's completely baseless claims of NATO countries allowing their territory airspace to be used for drone attacks on targets in Russia. These are dangerous lies. All 3 Baltic states have summoned Russia's representatives and handed them protest notes explicitly denying these accusations. Today, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service has taken a step further in escalating its disinformation campaign to open threats of use of force against the Republic of Latvia. And I quote, "Coordinates of decision-making centers on the territory of Latvia are well known. But NATO membership of the country will not protect terrorism enablers from just revenge. It is another demonstration of blatant disregard for international law and UN Charter. We strongly condemn such escalation and lies. All of the recent drone-related incidents in the Baltic states are solely the consequence of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Instead of continuing its malign information operations and threats, Russia must end its war and withdraw its armed forces from the whole internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. Mr. President, the United States administration, European leaders, and Ukraine had invested a great deal in bringing this war to an end. Russia continues to single-handedly undermine all of these efforts. And there remains only one way out: for Russia to agree to an immediate, full, and comprehensive ceasefire. Agree to a real ceasefire, leave Ukraine, and then the war will be over and there will be peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for the statement. I now give the floor to Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Director Goto and Director Wasono for their briefings today. Let me begin by strongly condemning last week's drone attack on OCHA staff in Ukraine. While all UN personnel survived, a local resident was tragically killed in the attack. I express my deep condolences to the family. Let there be no doubt this attack was not a mistake. The UN convoy was clearly marked as it delivered life-saving assistance to civilians in frontline communities under constant Russian attack. And a second drone made a double-tapped strike on the rescuers who assisted those trapped in the vehicle. And it was not an isolated incident either. Indeed, the very same day, in the very same region, a vehicle from World Central Kitchen was also attacked by a drone. Denmark calls for those responsible for these serious violations of international humanitarian law to be held fully accountable. Mr. President, Denmark deplores the dramatic escalation in Russia's deadly attacks on Ukraine's civilians. April had already become the deadliest month since September 2024, and May is regrettably looking to be even worse. Last week, in sustained airstrikes, Russia reportedly fired more than 4,500 drones, missiles, and bombs at Ukraine's cities. These coordinated attacks killed at least 52 civilians, including 3 children, and left over 300 injured. This was Russia's deadly response to Ukraine's offer to extend the 3-day ceasefire. The message it sent was as clear as it was desperate. Even without any prospect of a military victory, Russia's leaders have no interest in peace. Mr. President, Protection of Civilian Week offers an opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to civilians and the rules designed to protect them. Instead, we are confronted by one Council member's flagrant disregard, not only for the resolutions of this Council, but for international humanitarian law itself. The Secretary General's latest report is stark. At least 2,500 Ukrainian civilians were killed in 2025, a 70% increase from 2023. Most were killed either in the relentless blitz of Russian missiles, long-range drones, and bombs, or by Russia's barbaric use of first-person view drones to hunt civilians in frontline communities. The report also highlights Russia's attack on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure and the strikes on Ukraine's energy grids. And then there are all the outrageous strikes on healthcare facilities and double-tap strikes on emergency workers. To deliberately target those providing medical assistance to survivors of an attack is not only inhumane, but also a grave violation of the laws of war. Denmark calls for the full respect of international humanitarian law without exception. Mr. President, Denmark welcomed the ceasefire from 9 to 11 May. However imperfect, this could have built momentum towards a comprehensive ceasefire, the kind that Ukraine has been offering without preconditions since March 2025. We note Ukraine respected its pledges and only exercised its right to self-defense. And on 15 May, 205 prisoners of war were exchanged, though we hope the announced 1,000 for 1,000 swap can be fully realized very soon. Mr. President, it remains clear that a ceasefire is the first step towards a just, comprehensive and lasting peace. But this must be a ceasefire linked to a substantive peace process. It cannot be an act of performative diplomacy or a stalling tactic to allow President Putin to further string along the international community. A ceasefire must be grounded in the UN Charter. Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity must be fully respected. Peace can only be achieved through the hard yards of diplomacy, in which both sides and any mediator must take part in intense, good faith negotiations. These are not revolutionary concepts. They have underpinned all peace deals ending protracted conflicts. Quick fixes will not stick, and neither will efforts to withdraw internationally recognized borders by force. Regrettably, we see no evidence of the Kremlin accepts these realities. The international community must therefore maintain maximum pressure on Russia to engage seriously in diplomacy. In closing, Mr. President, Denmark will continue to stand by Ukraine. Ukraine is not only defending its own territory, but also the principles upon which this organization was founded. Ukraine's people and its people alone should be the ones to decide their future, free from coercion, free from aggression, and that begins with a just, comprehensive and lasting peace. We call on Russia, once again, to engage seriously to this end. I thank you.
I thank Denmark for the statement. I give the floor to France.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to begin by thanking Ms. Kayako Goto, Director for Europe, Central Asia and the Americas, as well as Ms. Edem Wasonu, Director of Operations at the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, for their valuable briefings. Once again, we deeply regret another missed opportunity to establish a lasting ceasefire. This ceasefire could have helped reduce the suffering endured by the Ukrainian population and also advance peace negotiations. Indeed, after advocating for a temporary ceasefire covering the May 9 celebrations in Moscow, Russia refused to extend this truce. The consequence was the continuation of the war on the front lines, where Russia has been bogged down for months, as well as the resumption of bombardments of unprecedented scale against Ukrainian cities, particularly the capital. These attacks claimed more than 20 lives on the night of May 14 alone, and involved more than 650 drones and 50 missiles. On the same day, a humanitarian convoy of the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs came under drone attack in Kherson in blatant violation of international humanitarian law, which must be respected under all circumstances. Attacks against civilians are illegal, attacks against humanitarian workers are illegal, and they may constitute war crimes, it must be said. President, 1 month ago in this very chamber, we made the same comment regarding the lack of follow-up to the Easter truce, which was broken by massive bombardments against Ukraine, despite the outstretched hand of the Ukrainian president, who had proposed making the cessation of hostilities permanent. After more than 4 years of a high-intensity war of aggression, this Council cannot resign itself to accepting temporary ceasefires used by Russia at its convenience before resuming, as it sees fit, its war of aggression against Ukraine. Together with the Secretary-General of the United Nations and with the vast majority of member states from every continent, we call finally for the immediate implementation of a complete and unconditional ceasefire. Russia must heed this message coming from all corners of the world. It is the responsibility of this Council to lead efforts in that direction. President, Ukraine is defending itself. It is defending its sovereignty and territorial integrity. It is acting within its rights, and our collective support for its legitimate self-defense remains unwavering. Our support will continue to be expressed in tangible ways, whether that be through financial and military assistance or through support for initiatives aimed at combating impunity, such as the creation within the Council of Europe of a special tribunal to prosecute the crime of aggression against Ukraine, complementing the work of the International Criminal Court. France and its partners will not accept the continuation of war in Europe. Together with the coalition of the willing, we are preparing the necessary security guarantees for a lasting peace. We seek a good faith dialogue to build a just and lasting peace on our continent, for Ukraine and for Europe, because that is our responsibility. It is time for Russia to engage fully in this effort. Thank you.
感谢法国。
I thank France for the statement, and I'll give the floor to Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to start by thanking you for convening this meeting and Directors Goto and Wasorno for their remarks. I also welcome the presence of Ukraine in this chamber. Mr. President, today's meeting takes place during the Protection of Civilians Week. Tomorrow, in the yearly thematic open debate, Member States will undoubtedly vouch for the need to protect civilians worldwide as they do each year. Yet, there is no respite for Ukraine. For the 5th consecutive year, Ukrainian civilians are forced to suffer unimaginable horrors, subjected to brutal, continuous and escalated Russian attacks against civilian objects and critical infrastructure. We are all aware of the horrific statistics of civilian casualties. According to the latest Secretary General report on the protection of civilians, more than 2,500 civilians were killed and 12,000 injured in Ukraine in 2025, a 31% increase from 2024 and a 70% increase from 2023. In the first 4 months of this year, confirmed civilian casualties rose by more than 20% compared to the same period of last year. These are not mere numbers on a document. These are lives destroyed by an illegal war of aggression. And already, these figures are rendered obsolete by the horrific attacks of this month in Kiev and other big cities in Ukraine. Once more, children were among the victims, their lives cut short or permanently changed by injury, trauma, and loss. It is also regrettable that UN entities have increasingly been targeted. Last week's attack against a World Food Programme mission was added to the more than 80 similar attacks in the last 2 years, while another double-tap attack against an OCHA convoy similarly left no doubt of its international character. In that regard, we wish to remind the binding effect of the provisions of the humanitarian law, reflected in the Security Council Resolution 2730 on the protection of humanitarian and UN personnel. Greece condemns in the strongest terms any attacks against civilians, civilian infrastructure, and humanitarian personnel striving to provide relief. And we call for the unconditional and full respect of international humanitarian law. Mr. President, we are equally worried over the possible catastrophic consequences which could result from the nuclear endangerment of the Chernobyl 40 years after the tragic nuclear accident and Zaporizhzhia nuclear plants. The voice of peace is difficult to hear in the midst of war. Greece joined the Secretary General in support of the 3-day ceasefire proposed by President Trump earlier this month, and calls for the full implementation of the agreement on a large-scale exchange of 1,000 prisoners from each side. Yet, short ceasefires are not enough. We reiterate our call for a comprehensive and sustainable ceasefire as a necessary step towards a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace that will be in line with international law and the United Nations Charter and will fully respect Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. Greece, always on the side of dialogue, international law, and the peaceful settlement of disputes, also regrets the stalling of the direct peace talks since last February and calls for their resumption in good faith. Lastly, we reiterate that Greece attaches great importance to the issue of the return of Ukrainian children, stresses the humanitarian, ethical, and legal consequences of their deportation and forcible transfer, and underlines that this issue should be central in any future peace talks. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank Director Gotto and Director Wasonu for their briefings today, and I welcome the participation of the representative of Ukraine and other countries of the region at our meeting. Colleagues, this Council exists to uphold international peace and security. Yet we meet again because the actions of a permanent member over the last 2 weeks have made one thing clear. Russia has no interest in peace. Despite repeated global calls for a ceasefire, President Putin has continued his deadly attacks on Ukraine, accepting a ceasefire only when it suited him. A pause long enough to protect his Victory Day parade. The moment the parade ended, the killing resumed. 24 people killed by a single strike on a block of apartments. Russia is lashing out in desperation. A state that needs a spectacle to mask its insecurity, and missiles to silence diplomacy, is not acting from confidence. It is acting from fear. Fear that Ukraine will endure and that Russia's aggression will fail. This disregard for life extends to those trying to save it. As we've heard today, last week, a clearly marked UN vehicle on humanitarian mission in Kherson was struck twice by drones, endangering humanitarians delivering vital aid. This is not an isolated incident. OCHA reports over 50 incidents affecting humanitarian personnel and operations so far this year. These attacks are straining a response on which millions rely. President Putin continues to choose deadly violence because he is desperate. Russia has killed over 150 civilians this month alone. His objectives remain unmet after over 4 years, and conditions at home continue to deteriorate. Russia's economy is increasingly subsumed by defense spending. And yet he continues, despite clear evidence that Ukraine is resisting effectively and imposing significant costs. As the Council marks Protection of Civilians Week, we remind Russia of their obligations under international law. And we echo the Secretary-General's call for a comprehensive ceasefire and a just and lasting peace. But peace begins with truth. This war could end the moment Russia stops its invasion. President Putin cannot achieve his goals by military means. Russia is losing more soldiers than it is recruiting. And at the rate it is seizing territory, it would take decades to achieve its war aims. So he is desperate to convince us all that Russia's victory is inevitable, that our support is a lost cause. But no one is falling for it. Europe's support is here to stay. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement, and I'll give the floor to Bahrain.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to welcome Ms. Kayoko Goto, Director and Officer in Charge for Europe, Central Asia,
and Americas at the UN Departments of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations, and Ms. Edim Wosurnu, Director of the Crisis Response Division at the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and I thank them for their valuable briefings. I also welcome the presence of the representative of Ukraine and the representatives of Iceland, Poland, Estonia, Romania, and the head of the EU delegation in today's meeting. Mr. President, the Kingdom of Bahrain is expressing grave concern for the ongoing war between the Russian Federation and the Republic of Ukraine for the 5th year in a row. We express our concern for continued attacks that target the infrastructure, energy facilities, railroads, ports, and roads, which is truly affecting daily life and jeopardizing the lives of civilians. In this regard, I would like to refer to the following points. The Kingdom of Bahrain welcomes the U.S.-brokered temporary ceasefire announcement. We encourage such steps which would lead to greater understanding and a comprehensive diplomatic settlement that would strengthen security and stability in the European continent. However, the Kingdom of Bahrain regrets the reported temporary ceasefire violations. We reaffirm the importance of capitalizing on such opportunities and transforming them into tangible results on the ground. The Kingdom of Bahrain supports the efforts of the Secretary General of the United Nations in his call for an immediate, comprehensive, unconditional and permanent ceasefire as a first step towards a just, sustainable and comprehensive peace to end this destructive war and restore security and stability in Europe in line with the principles of the UN Charter, the provisions of international law and relevant UN resolutions. The Kingdom of Bahrain reaffirms its support to all regional and international initiatives to end the war through dialogue and peaceful means, to alleviate its humanitarian repercussions. We reaffirm our support to U.S. mediation efforts as proposed by His Excellency President Trump to reach a ceasefire to strengthen security and stability at the regional and international levels and to strengthen a just and sustainable peace. The Kingdom of Bahrain appreciates the mediation efforts for the exchange of prisoners and other humanitarian efforts. These need to continue. In this regard, the Kingdom of Bahrain welcomes the recent mediation efforts, successful efforts, conducted by the United Arab Emirates between the Russian Federation and the Republic of Ukraine. This resulted in a new exchange operation that included 410 prisoners. We also commend the ongoing efforts of the United Arab Emirates, which contributed in the release of 7,101 prisoners since the start of the Ukrainian crisis through 23 mediation operations. The Kingdom of Bahrain also values the mediation efforts carried out by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which successfully contributed to the release of detainees and the exchange of prisoners between Russia and Ukraine, and the efforts of the State of Qatar, which reunited Ukrainian and Russian children with their families. These are positive and constructive humanitarian efforts that contribute to the calm and strengthens opportunities to reach a peaceful settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. The Kingdom of Bahrain warns of increasing expansion in the use of drones in wars, especially when they impact other countries that are not parties to the conflict. This development could lead to dangerous collateral consequences, such as an escalation in regional tension and the widening of the conflict, and this would threaten security and stability in Europe. In conclusion, Mr. President, the Kingdom of Bahrain supports all initiatives and endeavors to strengthen dialogue and diplomatic solutions to achieve a sustainable peace in Ukraine in line with the interest of all parties, and that would strengthen security and stability in Europe and the world. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Bahrain for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the DRC.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, the continued deterioration of the security and humanitarian situation in Ukraine is something that requires great attention on the part of the international community and of this Council in particular. It's even worse than this. This war becomes every day increasingly more sophisticated, more diffuse and more brutal, exposing millions of civilians to unspeakable suffering. The Democratic Republic of the Congo would like to thank, therefore, Ms. Kayoko Goto and Adam Wasurno, Director and Officer in charge for Europe, Central Asia, and the Americas within the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations, and Director of the Crisis Response Division within the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, respectively, for their briefings, which provided us with a great deal of information on security and humanitarian situation in Ukraine. We are holding our meeting at the time where our organization is commemorating the protection of civilians in armed conflicts. And at the same time, recent developments show us very brutally how urgent it is for this Council and for the international community as a whole to redouble their efforts so as to definitely put an end to this war, which had lasted far too long. Indeed, the protection of civilians cannot remain just a principle or a slogan that we repeat in our discussions. It must be a specific obligations, immediate and tangible. We need to therefore recall here that each new attack against inhabited areas, every response, intensification of hostilities pushes back the prospects for a peaceful and lasting solution. Mr. President, the Democratic Republic of the Congo reiterates its conviction that there is no possible military solution to this conflict. The events that took place over the weekend show that very clearly. In fact, the dangerous escalations we've been witnessing in the recent hours cannot help bring in a positive dynamic that we need in order to have a credible and lasting ceasefire between the parties. More than that, my delegation would like to express its very strong concern as regarding the new threshold this war has reached, where we are witnessing that the parties seem to be going further and further in their actions, and that the conflict keeps changing. And it leads us to the following possibility: the horror and disarray for future generations of adults, young people, and children who are hostages of this confrontational logic with tragic consequences, and which pushes back any and all prospect of political settlement. Every day, the risk of collateral damage for the civilian populations is growing exponentially. At the same time, we all know the sacred principles of international law and of the United Nations Charter, which guide our collective action. These principles establish, inter alia, that civilian populations are never to be targeted, nor should the civilian infrastructures be targeted specifically. Energy, networks, healthcare facilities, schools, people's homes, and the installations which are there to provide basic services. All of these things and people have to be protected under all circumstances. Mr. President, the briefings we've heard are unequivocal. The humanitarian situation in Ukraine requires our most urgent attention. My delegation would like to recall here that there is a need for all parties to the conflict to guarantee an access, a rapid, safe, lasting, and unimpeded access to all people in need in line with the relevant provisions of the international law and international humanitarian law. We also recall the need to protect the humanitarians, the healthcare workers, and the necessary infrastructure. Special attention needs to also be paid to the displaced women, children, the elderly, and people who are living with disability. The war in Ukraine is a very deep lesson for us. We see there that when conflict is going longer to the point where the borders between the battlefield and civilian space is blurred, we make more fragile not just the security of the people, but also the very foundations of international stability. In fact, as we mentioned earlier, this conflict beyond the operational plane continues producing transnational effects, which are worrying, in particular the recruitment of foreign nationals, including those who come from the African continent, sometimes under troubling conditions. And these are the indicators which need to convince us that we need to put a definite end to this logic of getting bogged down in this and make a definitive step towards rationality and responsibility. Mr. President, the recent developments show with concern for us that the longer the war goes on, the more humanitarian security consequences are deep and diffuse. To conclude, the Democratic Republic of the Congo urges the parties to break the logic of confrontation and give a genuine chance to peace by decisively favoring diplomacy. Given this reality, our collective responsibility cannot be to just resign ourselves to this. It needs to be for us to make diplomatic efforts even more and insist on strict protection of civilian populations. The DRC encourages, therefore, all diplomatic efforts and mediation which could bring the positions closer together to restore trust between parties, as was illustrated in the recent prisoner of war exchanges, and which show that dialogue remains possible and that they need to be preserved. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Democratic Republic of the Congo for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the United States.
And a thank you, of course, to our briefers today, and a welcome to our friends from Ukraine. It will not surprise you, colleagues, that President Trump wants to see the Russia-Ukraine war end. He has been dedicated to this and peace around the world since the American people returned him to the presidency. The barbarism of this war has devastated civilian life and critical infrastructure, especially Ukraine's energy grid. And in a continued global outrage, thousands of Ukrainian children have been forcibly deported from occupied territories and remain separated from their families, their homes, and those who love them. We, of course, urge Russia and Ukraine to negotiate in good faith and to put an end to the destruction and continued senseless violence. We call for an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire in advance of a durable and negotiated solution of the war. The mounting economic and human cost is unacceptable. The United States calls for Russia to allow humanitarian workers to access areas under its control. We likewise call on Russia to return all Ukrainian children it has unlawfully deported to Russia, as well as those it has forcibly transferred within occupied Ukrainian territory. These are not outrageous or novel requests. They are a reflection of basic human decency and a step toward that durable peace that we all seek. The United States remains committed to the return of Ukrainian children, and we are funding a $25 million program to that end. As Secretary Rubio said last week, Ukraine's reconstruction will take decades. Investing in Ukraine is key to stabilizing the region. The United States-Ukraine Reconstruction Investment Fund reflects our country's durable, long-term partnership and will advance our economic and joint national security. Through his words, actions, and leadership, President Trump is and remains and has been committed to a diplomatic end to this war. The United States, in fact, will do whatever it can to bring the war to a durable end. Mr. President, thank you.
感谢
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I now give the floor to Colombia.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this meeting and for the briefings presented by Director Goto and Director Wasono, and I also welcome the delegations joining us at today's meeting. Colombia takes note of the 3-day ceasefire announced between Russia and Ukraine on May 9th. However, my delegation deeply regrets the resumption and intensification of large-scale attacks that continue to cause civilian casualties and severe humanitarian consequences. It is regrettable that once again children are among the victims of the recent attacks, as well as the damage inflicted on homes, schools, and other infrastructure indispensable to the civilian population. We strongly condemn these attacks. We are particularly concerned by the growing impact of drone warfare and the use of long-range weapons in densely populated areas, whose effects reach not only civilians but also humanitarian, medical, and United Nations personnel. FPV drone attacks against an inter-agency mission led by OCHA in Kherson last week, as well as against a World Food Programme vehicle days earlier, demonstrate the increasing risks faced by personnel delivering life-saving assistance on the ground. We continue to be very concerned about gender-based violence as well in this conflict, including sexual violence. Colombia unequivocally condemns these acts, regardless of who commits them, and recalls that such conduct constitutes violations of international law. We underscore the need to effectively investigate all allegations, provide protection and comprehensive assistance for victims and survivors, and ensure access to justice and accountability. Mr. President, Colombia calls on all parties to strengthen measures for the protection of civilians and to refrain from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, given the high risk that they pose to those who are entitled to special protection under international humanitarian law. We also reiterate the importance of ensuring rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access, as well as the protection of humanitarian and United Nations personnel at all times, in accordance with international law. Likewise, we call for the humane treatment of prisoners of war and for the International Committee of the Red Cross to be granted access to them in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. We encourage initiatives that allow for the continuation of safe exchanges between the parties, especially involving those who are seriously wounded or ill. In conclusion, Colombia reiterates the urgency of reactivating and keeping open serious, sustained, and results-oriented channels of dialogue capable of generating verifiable progress. No temporary cessation of hostilities can substitute for a genuine political will on the part of the parties to advance towards a peaceful and sustainable solution in accordance with the UN Charter and international law. In that context, we also emphasize the importance of ensuring the full, effective, and meaningful participation of women in dialogue and negotiation efforts. Peace processes will be more legitimate, inclusive, and sustainable to the extent that they incorporate diverse perspectives representative of the societies affected by the conflict. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Colombia for the statement. I now give the floor to Liberia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Liberia thanks Denmark, France, Greece, Latvia, and the United Kingdom for convening this meeting. Liberia also thanks Ms. Kayako Goto, Director and Officer in Charge for Europe, Central Asia, and the Americas, for the Department of Political and Peacekeeping Affairs and Peace Operations, as well as the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, Crisis Response Division, Director Ms. Idem Wosono, for their informative briefings. We also welcome delegations joining us today for this briefing. Liberia speaks today not to rehearse the facts before us, but to confront what they signify. We are witnessing not simply the persistence of conflict in Ukraine, but a hardening pattern. Attacks and deadly violence are becoming more frequent, more expansive, and the deadly violence are becoming and more embedded in the civilian environment. Recent UN monitoring indicates that April alone saw at least 238 civilians killed and more than 1,400 injured, the highest monthly toll in nearly a year, underscoring a worsening trajectory. The distinction between military objectives and civilians is being dangerously eroded in apparent violation of international humanitarian law. The Council meets following a further reported surge in attacks, including extensive drone and missile strikes across multiple regions, as documented by UN entities and humanitarian partners. With rising civilian casualties and significant damage to energy and industrial infrastructure, what is most concerning is not only the scale, but the timing. Escalation appears to be advancing even in moments when restraint could have opened a diplomatic pathway. Against this backdrop, Liberia wishes to make the following points. First, the human dimension must not be forgotten. Behind every casualty is a person, a life, a mourning family, a future lost. This requires sharper focus and stronger effort from this Council. Reports of attacks and harm to civilians and civilian infrastructure, the situation of children separated from families, and the treatment of prisoners of war point to gravely concerning issues that cannot be deferred to a later political settlement. They demand immediate action, credible accountability mechanisms, and sustained monitoring. They demand action now, not deferred commitments. Liberia strongly condemns all attacks on aid workers and stand in solidarity with humanitarian personnel who risk their lives every day to bring relief to people in need. Second, we must reassert a simple principle. Wars are judged not only by how they are fought, but by what they leave behind. The cumulative impact of strikes on power grids, rail systems, and on civilians and their lifelines and critical infrastructure is not incidental. It reshapes entire societies and generations ahead. In Africa, including in Liberia's own experience, the collapse of such systems turned conflict into protracted national crisis, with consequences we are still battling today. The Council must therefore insist clearly and consistently that international humanitarian law is not optional, and when violated, there must be consequences, including through appropriate international investigative and accountability mechanisms. The obligations are clear. Parties must distinguish, must ensure proportionality, and must take all feasible precautions to protect civilians and the critical infrastructure systems that sustain them. Liberia urges renewed urgency in upholding the protection of civilians, ensuring the safety and reunification of children, and guaranteeing the humane treatment of all detainees without exception and in all circumstances. Third, this conflict is entering a phase where escalation risks becoming self-sustaining. The emerging pattern of strikes and counter-strikes is creating a self-reinforcing escalation loop that sidelines diplomacy. History shows that when wars reach this stage, they do not end decisively. They end painfully and often unpredictably. For the Council, the implication is clear. Managing escalation is no longer enough. We must begin to disrupt it. In conclusion, Mr. President, Liberia calls for an immediate halt to attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure consistent with international humanitarian law. As the Secretary General has warned, this war remains a stain on our collective conscience, with a human toll that continues to deepen. Therefore, even limited reciprocal steps toward de-escalation can begin to alter the trajectory of this conflict. Liberia underscores that diplomacy must remain primacy. Any sustainable outcome will require engagement anchored in the Charter, including respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. There is no alternative pathway that avoids prolonged instability. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Liberia for the statement. I now give the floor to Pakistan.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I thank Ms. Goto and Ms. Wosornu for their insightful briefings. The conflict in Ukraine has continued to rage for over 4 years, leaving widespread destruction in its wake. The fighting has caused devastating consequences for human life and livelihoods. We are deeply perturbed by the continuation of hostilities and deplore the reports regarding recent escalation in attacks, worsening the dire humanitarian situation in the region. Such actions only serve to further deepen and prolonging the conflict, erode trust, and undermine meaningful pathway to peace. Civilians in particular have continued to bear the brunt of the ongoing hostilities. We reiterate our principled position that protecting civilians, humanitarian personnel, and civilian infrastructure is a fundamental legal obligation under international humanitarian law. IHL must be fully upheld by all parties under all circumstances. Mr. President, during the last year or so, we have witnessed announcements regarding temporary ceasefires, including the latest one this month. We commend these initiatives and those related to the exchange of prisoners of war from both sides and the returns of the remains of deceased servicemen. We see these efforts as enablers and confidence-building measures which need to be sustained for creating the conditions necessary for bringing about a complete cessation of hostilities and achieving lasting peace. From the outset, Pakistan has maintained that dialogue is the sole path to lasting peace in Ukraine. Today, more than ever before, global opinion strongly favors this objective. We hope that both parties, facilitated by the United States, would resume the dialogue process at an early date with a view to bringing this long-drawn conflict to an end. We urge both sides to prioritize diplomacy, exercise genuine political will, and engage constructively and meaningfully towards a just and lasting, mutually acceptable settlement, respecting legitimate security interests of all sides, the UN Charter, international law, and relevant multilateral agreements. Towards this end, Pakistan will continue to support all efforts aimed at a comprehensive, durable, and peaceful resolution of the conflict. I thank you.
Okay.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement. I now give the floor to Panama.
Mr. President, we'd like to thank Ms. Goto, Director and Officer in charge for Europe, Central Asia and the Americas of the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and Ms. Wosono, Director of OCHA's Crisis Response Division, for their informative briefings. We also recognize the participation of the distinguished delegations joining us today in the Chamber. As the war in Ukraine continues, the civilian population remains exposed to a persistent cycle of violence. According to the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission, the situation continues to worsen. In April, at least 238 civilians were killed and 1,404 were injured in Ukraine, representing an 18% increase compared with April 2025 and a 13% increase compared with March 2026. In this context, the recent ceasefire mediated by the United States between May 9th and May 11th was not respected. Panama therefore calls on the parties to continue striving to achieve a complete ceasefire, an indispensable component for bringing this war to an end. For its part, the recent commitment to exchange prisoners of war reflects the continuation of efforts aimed at adopting humanitarian measures between the parties. And Panama hopes that the process will be carried out in good faith so that it may be consolidated as a mechanism focused on the protection of prisoners of war and victims of the conflict. President, the impact of the war does not distinguish between victims, but it is especially concerning that women and girls continue to be among the groups disproportionately affected, particularly as a result of one of the deadliest winters since the beginning of the war during the first months of this year. Likewise, women and children account for 90% of the millions of displaced persons, a reality that continues to affect the social and psychological well-being of displaced populations, and that will leave an enduring mark on future generations. Meanwhile, Ukraine continues to suffer the effects of damage to critical civilian infrastructure, particularly in the transportation and energy sectors. The escalation continues on both fronts, with attacks on Russia's energy infrastructure, which has also resulted in civilian deaths. Within this framework, the recent attacks affecting humanitarian personnel and United Nations OCHA staff underscore the dangerous conditions under which assistance operations are being carried out on the ground in an increasingly severe security environment. During this week, when the spotlight is on the protection of civilians in armed conflict, we must translate that focus into concrete actions to guarantee the safety of all personnel, including medical personnel, in accordance with international humanitarian law. Mr. President, in closing, Panama reiterates, as we have done many times over the last 4 years, and throughout its year and several months as an elected member of this Council, that political will must prevail and that frank dialogue yielding concrete results towards a final ceasefire must be what guides the parties involved. We call upon all parties with influence to keep the channels of communication open and to ensure that international stability prevails over war. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement. I now give the floor to Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Ms. Goto and Ms. Wosono for their briefing. As we convene today, my delegation remains greatly concerned by the continued deterioration of both security and humanitarian situation in Ukraine. The ongoing hostility serves only to prolong human suffering and further diminish the prospect for sustainable peace. We are troubled by the continued escalation of military actions affecting civilian and civilian infrastructure. The humanitarian toll of this protracted conflict remains stark. The protection of civilians, particularly the most vulnerable, and the preservation of schools, hospitals, and homes are non-negotiable obligations enshrined in international humanitarian law. Somalia reiterates that all parties must prioritize de-escalation, exercise utmost restraint, and commit to an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire. We remain convinced that there is no military solution to this protracted conflict. Dialogue and diplomacy remain the sole viable means to bring this crisis to an end. In this regard, Somalia welcomes the ongoing international diplomatic initiatives and the recent trilateral talks involving the United States, Ukraine, and the Russian Federation. These engagements continue to present vital steps toward a de-escalation, and we hope they will lay the ground for a constructive and durable path forward. Furthermore, we welcome the recent humanitarian milestone achieved through dialogue. Specifically, we welcome the 3-day ceasefire reached in May, which successfully facilitated a major prisoner of war exchange. Such milestones serve as an essential confidence-building measures and remind us that even amidst of a deep division, cooperation remains possible. A durable and just resolution must address the underlying root causes of this conflict and be fully consistent with the purpose and principles of the United Nations Charter. Lasting peace will require compromise, confidence-building measures, and a shared vision of common and sustainable security. In closing, Mr. President, my delegation reaffirms its unwavering support for all diplomatic efforts aimed at achieving a resolution that restores peace, security, and stability. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement.
I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of China. Colleagues, I thank Director Goto and Director Usunu for their briefings. As the Ukraine crisis persists, the battlefield remains fiercely deadlocked, with escalated spillover effects, profoundly impacting the international landscape. This is unsustainable and requires utmost efforts to reverse. In light of the recent developments, I would like to make 3 points. First, the parties must exercise restraint and dedicate maximum effort to civilian safety. As we speak, a new intense round of hostilities is underway. In addition to intensified frontline exchanges, frequent attacks on each other's civilian infrastructure have resulted in heavy casualties among innocent civilians. The increased deployment of new weaponry, such as drones and robots, has exponentially ramped up the lethality and destructiveness of the conflict, which is deeply distressing and concerning. China urges the parties to remain calm and restrained, strictly adhere to international humanitarian law, refrain from attacking civilians or civilian infrastructure, and work toward de-escalation and an early ceasefire to end the hostilities. Second, parties must meet each other halfway and remain committed to advancing the peace talks. While the door to negotiations on the Ukraine issue has been opened, issues of such complexity defy any easy solutions, and peace talks cannot succeed overnight. The more complex the situation, the more vital it is to cling to hope with redoubled efforts. We've recently seen positive developments with both Russia and Ukraine releasing positive signals for subsequent negotiations. A 3-day temporary ceasefire was reached, and they agreed to exchange 1,000 prisoners of war. These steps are conducive to building mutual trust and dispelling doubts. China hopes the parties will maintain contact, demonstrate political will and flexibility to each other, seek common ground while managing differences through dialogue, accumulate consensus in the course of negotiations, and work toward a comprehensive, lasting, and binding peace agreement at an early date. Third, to achieve lasting peace, we must address both the symptoms and the root causes of the conflict. There is no such thing as quote-unquote absolute security in the world. Russia, Ukraine, and the rest of Europe are neighbors that cannot be moved away. Taking seriously one another's security concerns and achieving peaceful coexistence is the only realistic choice. We urge relevant parties to abandon the Cold War mentality and camp-based confrontation, implement the vision of common comprehensive cooperative and sustainable security, and explore the broadest common ground that accommodates one another's concerns, thereby forging a balanced, effective, and sustainable regional security architecture. China's position on the Ukraine issue is consistent and clear. President Xi Jinping solemnly stated that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be respected. The purpose and principles of the UN Charter should be fully observed. The legitimate security concerns of all countries should be taken seriously, and all efforts conducive to the peaceful settlement of the crisis should be supported. These 4 shoulds serve as China's authoritative position and fundamental guide on the Ukraine issue. China hopes that this conflict will end soon and has taken extensive work in its own way to promote peace and facilitate talks. We've maintained close communication with Russia, Ukraine, and other relevant parties, actively engaging in shadow diplomacy and persistently creating conditions and building consensus for peace. We stand ready to work with the international community to continue playing a constructive role in promoting the political settlement of the crisis. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of China. The representative of Latvia asked for the floor again. I give him the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to thank the permanent representative of the Russian Federation for quoting the very same public statement of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service that I quoted in my speech. This is pure fiction and pure lies, and I will not abuse of the Council members' time in detail debunking these lies. You will receive that in writing. I will just repeat: lies and aggressive disinformation and threats are a sign of despair and weakness. And we have seen similar lies addressed against other members of this Council in the previous meetings. So I'm very honored to have the attention drawn to my country today. Thank you.
Thank the representative of Latvia for the statement. The U.S. is asking for the floor again. I give her the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are addressing comments made by another member of the UN Security Council. There is no place for threats against a council member. The United States keeps all of its NATO commitments. That's it. Thank you.
I thank the United States for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
And I now give the floor to Iceland.
Mr. President, colleagues, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 5 Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Iceland. I want to thank the briefers here for their very clear and informative briefings. For the past 4 years, we have repeatedly underscored that Russia's aggression against Ukraine is a war of choice, and that Russia can end the aggression and bring this war to an end immediately. Yet their actions have so far demonstrated a lack of true intention to pursue peace. Today's meeting takes place against the backdrop of renewed large-scale Russian attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. This included aerial bombs and a series of long-range missiles and drone strikes, killing and injuring civilians across the country. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine reported at least 70 killed and 500 injured only in the first weeks of May. Among those killed and injured were medical personnel aiding people affected by a previous drone attack. These attacks are blatant violations of international law, including international humanitarian law. There must be accountability for Russia's acts committed against and within Ukraine. Mr. President, Ukraine wished to extend the recent 3-day ceasefire, but Russia responded by launching drone attacks that once again targeted civilian areas and critical infrastructure. It is clear that Russia's actions stand in stark contrast to any genuine commitments to de-escalation or peace. Meanwhile, Ukraine continues to pursue peace while exercising its inherent right to self-defense, as enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter. Russia, however, continues to violate the Charter in its continued illegal assault on the sovereignty and territorial integrity of another UN member state. Mr. President, Russia's aggression has been marked by countless violations of international humanitarian law and continues to cause devastating human suffering across Ukraine. Thousands of civilians have been killed or injured. Millions have been displaced, while homes, schools, hospitals, and other civilian infrastructure have been destroyed on a massive scale. It is deeply concerning that harm to the civilian population demonstrably intensified in 2025 and 26, with civilian casualties rising significantly compared to 2023 and 24. The Ukrainian people have also suffered the dire consequences of sustained and systematic attacks on civilians and civilian objects, including on their energy infrastructure. Last week, humanitarian convoys were attacked by drones on 2 separate occasions. We are alarmed by the repeated instances of violence against humanitarian workers, which is a clear violation of international humanitarian law. While recognizing the devastating effects of the war on the Ukrainian population, we again pay tribute to the resilience of the Ukrainian people. Ukraine, justice and the rule of law must prevail. Mr. President, the deportation and forcible transfer of Ukrainian children is particularly abhorrent. This is not an incidental consequence of war, but a calculated strategy pursued by Russia in order to harm Ukraine's future. The Nordic countries demand that Russia ensures the immediate, safe and unconditional return of all the forcibly transferred and abducted Ukrainian children. We will spare no effort until those children are returned and justice has prevailed. Mr. President, we renew the call for Russia to end its aggression and immediately withdraw its forces from Ukrainian territory to within its own internationally recognized borders and to meet its responsibilities as a permanent member of this Council. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Iceland for the statement. I now give the floor to Poland.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting, and we also thank the briefers for their interventions. Poland aligns itself with the statement to be delivered on behalf of the European Union and its member states. We strongly condemn the continued large-scale attacks carried out by the Russian Federation against Ukraine, which once again demonstrate that Russia deliberately uses terror against civilians as a method of warfare. We are also outraged by the Russian attack on a clearly marked United Nations humanitarian convoy operating in the Kherson region. Strikes against humanitarian personnel and UN operations constitute a blatant violation of international humanitarian law. As we mark the UN Protection of Civilians Week, there is a tragic irony that at this table sits a permanent member responsible for deliberate attacks against civilians, humanitarian personnel, and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. These attacks cannot remain without consequences. Accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity remains indispensable for achieving a just and lasting peace. Mr. President, another crime is the unlawful transfer of children. Russia is attempting to rob Ukraine of its most precious resource, the next generation. We call on Russia to immediately stop these unlawful transfers and other grave violations affecting Ukrainian children. While many conflicts around the world are indeed complex, the war in Ukraine is defined by a few simple truths. First, the only root cause of this war is Russian imperialism. Addressing the root causes of the conflict means making Russia realize that there is no place for such reasoning in the modern world. Second, Ukraine is exercising its inherent right to self-defense in line with the UN Charter, while Russia's war of aggression is illegal, period. And third, to end this war, Russia must simply stop waging it. The sole responsibility for its continuation and further escalation lies with the Russian Federation. We find it difficult to identify any benefits this war has brought to Russia or its citizens. People are dying, the Russian economy is facing significant structural challenges, and Russia's international standing has been severely damaged. And for some reason yet, it continues, as we heard today in this room, with Russia continuing to spreading disinformation and threatening a council and a fellow NATO member. And we condemn such irresponsible statements. This war, Mr. President, has no justification other than the neo-colonial ambitions, which will not be fulfilled. Every day of Russia continuing this war is a road to nowhere. Applying further pressure on Russia, including through new sanctions, and maintaining robust assistance to Ukraine remain the only way to influence Russia's position in the direction of peace which is not the direction of Sarmat ICBM test launches, staging or organizing ongoing nuclear exercises with Belarus, or further militarization in that context of the Kaliningrad Oblast. Poland remains committed to long-term efforts aimed at Ukraine's reconstruction and strengthening its resilience as a foundation for regional security. And with that in mind, we aim to mobilize broad international support for Ukraine's reconstructions already next month with the Ukraine Recovery Conference in Gdańsk. And that is because, Mr. President, to stand firmly with Ukraine, as Poland does, is to stand firmly with international law and the principles upon which this organization was founded. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland and now give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Baltic states. We also align with the statement of the European Union. For more than 4 years now, this Council has met because Russia continues its brutal war of aggression against Ukraine. Yet as long as this war continues, we will continue to condemn Russia's violations of international law, defend the principles of the UN Charter, and stand firmly with Ukraine. Ukraine proposed a genuine, immediate, and open-ended ceasefire on the 6th of May. Russia rejected it. Instead, it used its so-called Victory Day ceasefire to secure its military parade in Moscow. For the first time in generations, Russia could not hold its own parade without fear. It was held in a reduced format and under extraordinary security measures, a telling reflection of the true state of Putin's war machine. Instead of merely scaling down its military parade, Russia should end its aggression against Ukraine and withdraw every military unit back to its own territory. Even during the declared truce period, Russia carried out more than 140 attacks along the front line and launched 850 drones against Ukraine. As President Zelensky stated, Russia sought a pause to hold their parade, to go out onto the square safely for an hour, and then continue killing. Indeed, while Russia attempts to present itself as a party seeking peace, recent days have once again demonstrated Russia's intensified attacks against Ukraine. Hundreds of drones and missiles continue to target civilians and critical infrastructure across the country, including some of the largest coordinated aerial attacks against Ukraine since the start of the full-scale invasion. The strike against a clearly marked United Nations humanitarian mission vehicle in Kherson on 15 May was cynical and unacceptable, deliberately targeting humanitarian personnel whose movements had been previously notified to the parties, demonstrates once again Russia's disregard for international humanitarian law. United Nations personnel continue carrying out invaluable humanitarian work under extremely difficult conditions. The humanitarian impact remains immense. Millions of Ukrainians remain displaced globally and internally. An urgent response is needed to the rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation in the temporarily occupied city of Oloshki in Kherson Oblast. The city is on the verge of a full-scale humanitarian catastrophe, and civilians are being deprived of the most basic necessities for survival. Immediate evacuation efforts and unhindered humanitarian access are urgently needed. Russia's systematic deportation, forced transfer, indoctrination and militarization of Ukrainian children constitute war crimes and an attempt to erase Ukrainian identity. Nearly 20,500 Ukrainian children are estimated to have been unlawfully deported or forcibly transferred to Russia. Russia must immediately and unconditionally return all deported children. Children must never become a bargaining chip. We reiterate our support for full accountability, including the work of the International Criminal Court and the establishment of the Special Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine. We therefore welcome the adoption on 15 May of the Council of Europe resolution on the Special Tribunal. Backed by broad international support and sending Russia a clear and united message that there can be no impunity for the crime of aggression. Mr. President, President Putin has recently suggested that the war may be coming to an end and expressed willingness for direct contacts with President Zelensky. Those words must now be matched by actions. The path to peace is clear. Russia must stop attacking civilians, withdraw its forces, and abandon its imperial ambitions. Until that day comes, the Baltic states will continue standing firmly with Ukraine, its independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, and with the principles of the United Nations Charter, upon which this organization was founded. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Estonia for the statement. Now give the floor to Romania.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Romania aligns with the statement of the European Union. We appreciate the convening of today's meeting, and I would also like to thank the briefers. As calls for peace, including from this Council, get stronger, while Ukraine and the United States and European partners remain engaged in advancing diplomacy, Russia's latest strikes against Ukraine, among the largest of its invasion, which we strongly condemn, expose once more the genuine will from Russia to end this war is missing. Its latest actions prove the contrary. Russia's refusal of a lasting ceasefire, repeated escalations, and continued strikes on civilians and civilian infrastructure point again to a matter of choice. The choice to continue an illegal and unprovoked war in blatant disregard of its responsibility as a permanent member of this Council to uphold the UN Charter principles and international law. We reiterate our support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We will stand with Ukraine and its people for as long as it is needed in their legitimate self-defense against the aggressor and in the exercise of their sovereign right to freely choose their future. A principled and unwavering rejection of the aggression against Ukraine is the path to bring this war closer to its end and to reaffirm the authority of the UN Charter and this Council. And this is the only option that UN member states should be considering. Mr. President, as reported, massive, intense attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure across Ukraine resumed after the 3 days ceasefire. Tragically, innocent life was again lost in the latest strikes. Residential areas, energy, railway, and port infrastructure in several regions of Ukraine sustained damage. A UN humanitarian convoy was hit, and such conduct, which is unacceptable under international humanitarian law, should draw a line for this Council in front of the aggressor, and we must uphold in stronger terms the principles of international law. The aggression against Ukraine must cease, and Russia must agree to an immediate, full and unconditional ceasefire, and to meaningfully engage in negotiations towards a just and lasting peace. A comprehensive, just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter and the principles of sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity applicable to all nations, supported by robust and workable security guarantees, is what will ensure Ukraine and the whole international community in face of an aggressor whose historical record of relapsing into breaches of international law raises a matter of trust. As reaffirmed in the joint statement of the leaders of the Bucharest 9 and Nordic Allies Summit in Bucharest on 13th of May last week, we welcome the ongoing peace efforts of the United States, together with allies and partners, and commend Ukraine for its constructive engagement. We will maintain our unwavering support for Ukraine. Mr. President, since its beginning, we have drawn this Council's attention to the regional and global impact of this aggression and how the conditions of a peace in Ukraine concern the security and prosperity of all. On 2nd and 7th of May, my country faced new intrusions in the national airspace as the irresponsible Russian drone attacks in the close proximity of Ukraine's fluvial border with Romania continued. This is unacceptable under the UN Charter and international law. Mr. President, bringing back Ukrainian children forcibly transferred or deported to Russia remains central to a lasting peace. We support progress through the International Coalition for the Return of the Ukrainian Children and further efforts stemming from the implementation of the General Assembly Resolution Return of Ukrainian Children, as well as to ensure full accountability. Accountability is key to a lasting peace. Romania recently notified the Council of Europe of its decision to join the enlarged partial agreement for the Special Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine. And we will continue to support Ukraine in ensuring justice through relevant accountability mechanisms. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Romania for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, head of the delegation of the EU to the United Nations.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states, the candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Georgia, as well as Liechtenstein, Andorra, and Monaco, align themselves with this statement. I thank the Chinese presidency for convening this meeting, and thank you to the briefers for their updates. Colleagues, as Russia continues its unprovoked aggression against Ukraine, as it escalates its daily drone and missile strikes against civilians, as it doubles down on its colonial goal of subjugating Ukraine, the European Union stands firmly in defense of international law and the UN Charter. From day one of Russia's invasion, we have supported Ukraine in exercising its inherent right to self-defense in line with Article 51 of the Charter. 1,545 days of Russian attacks later, we continue to do so. Last month, the EU agreed on a €90 billion loan to Ukraine to cover the country's budgetary and defense needs. A loan that is to be repaid by Ukraine only once it has received reparations from Russia, because Russia must take responsibility for the full effect and the consequences of its actions and realize that we will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. There should be no doubt in distinguishing between an aggressor and a victim. Russia has launched a full-scale invasion of its neighbor, and UN member states should continue to call it out for what it is, as they've done since 2022. And today, Russia has had the gall to go forward, to threaten a member of the Security Council and an EU member state. This desperate aggressor appears to have shed all pretenses of reason, measure, modesty, or dignity. And every member of this council should tell them so. Accusations which we often hear in this chamber from the aggressor, that the European Union is prolonging the conflict, are a head-spinning distortion of the reality on the ground. We support a full, unconditional, and immediate ceasefire, as well as a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine in line with the UN Charter, international law, and relevant UN resolutions. In other conflicts, too, we see the importance of a ceasefire as a first step to allow for peace talks, including very recently. Diplomatic efforts need to be stepped up without delay, and the EU has been actively involved in this regard. Supporting Ukraine militarily does not contradict the pursuit of peace. It is a precondition for credible negotiations. Russia, the aggressor, is also seeking military support from other nations, except in the case, of course, including other nations' boots on Ukrainian territory. But it is doing so for very different reasons: to continue its war and to subjugate Kiev. Russia has shown little interest in genuine talks, while intensifying military action on the front, as well as drone and missile attacks against civilians. Colleagues, listen to this. Last week, Russia launched over 1,500 drones and dozens of missiles against Ukrainian cities, killing 24 civilians, including 3 children. For the first time since its attempted full-scale invasion, it also struck the capital of the Zakarpattia region. A UN humanitarian convoy in Kherson was hit. International humanitarian law must be respected, and attacks against humanitarian personnel, civilians, and critical civilian infrastructure must not also only cease, but they must be condemned unequivocally by everyone. We urge all members of this Council to work with us in pressuring Russia's decision makers to engage meaningfully. This is also the logic behind the EU's sanctions of Russia. Decision makers in Moscow seem entirely unmoved by the reported 1.3 million Russian casualties of this senseless war. To raise the cost of the illegal aggression for Russia's leadership, the EU has adopted 20 packages of restrictive measures. Over 2,600 individuals and entities are now subject to travel bans, asset freezes, and economic sanctions. By constraining Russia's military-industrial complex, its energy and financial services sectors, and the support it receives from third countries, the EU seeks to limit Russia's ability to continue its war of aggression, to ensure there is accountability for violations of international law and human rights, and to incentivize Russia's elites to come to the negotiating table, finally and seriously. Mr. President, children are among those most severely impacted by Russia's aggression. Their protection is a shared responsibility of the international community. I reiterate the EU's urgent call on Russia and Belarus to immediately ensure the safe and unconditional return to Ukraine of all unlawfully deported and forcibly transferred Ukrainian children. We recall the December decision of the UN General Assembly, and we welcome the leadership of the SRSG for Children and Armed Conflict, who has recently traveled to Kiev and Moscow. Last week, the EU hosted a high-level meeting of the Coalition for the Return of Ukrainian Children in Brussels, together with Ukraine and Canada. We have provided support to war-affected children, families, and communities, and we have sanctioned over 100 individuals and entities involved in deportation, forced transfer, and the so-called re-education of Ukrainian children. How chilling. Re-education. They cannot continue thinking they're Ukrainians. How chilling. President, our support to Ukraine is a signal that any aggression is unacceptable under international law, and that aggressors such as Russia will face accountability and will never be allowed to change borders by force. The future of Ukraine and its citizens lies within the European Union. The Ukrainian people have a right to choose their own destiny, including a path towards EU membership. No former imperial power, however irredentist or aggressive, should be allowed to change that, or can change that for that matter. Thank you.
Well, I thank Mr. Lamborghini for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.